Boomers ruined everything. And that's what the internet is saying a lot right now, and I very much get that sentiment. They bought houses for what your monthly rent costs like right now, and they walked into careers with a handshake and left with a pension. And a lot of them have spent their political power protecting that wealth instead of rebuilding the conditions that created it. But here's the thing that really nagged me and what I was really thinking about when I dug into this issue. Young boomers asked the same questions that we're asking right now. They didn't experience the same conditions as us, but they were in the same places, the same four corners of the human experience that produced the dread you already know. And when you trace that all the way back further than Gen Z, further than boomers, what I found was actually the most hopeful thing I've come across in a very long time, and one that'll give us more clear direction of how we can overcome this nihilism that we're all feeling right now, so that we can actually make a difference in issues such as the loneliness epidemic or the job market right now. That's the story that this video is telling, not one about how Gen Z is doomed, because you can just watch any other video on YouTube and get that story, but this video is more so about how we can learn from the generations that came before us and how we can apply those same lessons to build a more fulfilling life today. You've seen the videos about Gen Z, that housing crisis, the student debt, the job market, the loneliness epidemic. At this point, the content practically writes itself. And if you've watched enough of it like I have, then you already know how bad it is. But before we go any further, I want to acknowledge that this video isn't a video that lets boomers off the hook. They did have it easier, and that's real. It's not up for debate, actually. According to inequality.org's analysis of the Federal Reserve data, the top 10% of boomers had 61% of their entire generation's wealth. The boomer who owns 3 investment properties and the boomer living off entirely Social Security are not the same person, and they are also not the same enemy. The real fault has never been between generations, it's always between the people who own things and the people who don't. And the people who most benefit from boomers and zoomers pointing at each other are the same exact people who own the apartments we live in, the businesses we work at, and the campaigns of the politicians making the rules. So here's a question that most of these videos don't really spend enough time asking and pondering. Why does it feel like it's all the same thing? The rising housing market, the growing debt, the terrible job market, and the loneliness epidemic. 4 completely different crises, and yet underneath all of them sits the same dread, the same feeling that the future isn't available to you, and that the life you were told you were building towards keeps moving further away no matter what you do. The feeling itself is anxiety, but it's not a quirk of Gen Z being the mental health generation. It's what happens to human beings when the things that make life feel worth living get threatened all at once. When your ability to build a family, find stable work, feel financially free, and connect with the people around you all start slipping simultaneously. What I want to show you is something I genuinely haven't seen anyone say out loud, that young boomers felt the same anxiety when they were our age. The 4 pillars that create a fulfilled human life not only just threaten Gen Z, but has also produced the same dread that boomers have felt as well. So let's go through all 4 of them. Here's the underlying thing when it comes to when we all discuss the housing crisis. It's not really about the house. What people are actually talking about is a thing that makes a home possible, a place stable enough to raise children in, and a place that belongs to you, where you can build something that outlasts a lease agreement, and somewhere to put down roots deep enough that the people you love know where to find you. The house was never just a destination, it was the foundation everything else got built on top of. And right now that foundation is out of reach in a way that's starting to reshape not just where Gen Z lives, but how they imagine their future lives. In 2024, only about 26% of Gen Z adults own a home, and by their late 20s, they're already behind in every previous generation, and that gap isn't just a delayed purchase, it's literally a delayed life. The average age for a first marriage in 2024 was 30.2 for men and 26.6 for women, numbers that were just 23.5 and 21.3 just 50 years ago. The average age of a first-time mother has hit a record high. Nearly half of 18 to 29-year-olds are still living with their parents, which is the highest since the Great Depression. I want you to know that these aren't just statistics. When you zoom out, you start to see a portrait of an entire generation that's actually quietly grieving a timeline that we were promised but can no longer access. Not because we don't want it, but because by the spring of 2024, the typical monthly mortgage payment had reached a record of $2,800 a month, and wages haven't come close to keeping up with that. So we wait, and as we've waited, the question underneath all of this starts to become unanswered. Is the life I want even possible anymore? When boomers were in their prime home buying years in the early 1980s, mortgage rates spiked above 16%. And for reference, in 2026, 6% already feels impossibly high. The share of median household income needed to make a typical mortgage payment averaged 33.2% during the years boomers turned 30, the highest of any living generation. Once in every $3 you earn goes straight to housing before you do anything else with it. The nuclear family that parents treated as a natural order of things was fracturing around them in real time. Divorce rates had climbed to an all-time high, and the post-war promise of marry young, buy a home, raise children, build something stable, it was all colliding with an economic reality that made the vision felt like it belonged to someone else, not themselves. In California in the late 1970s, surveys of women visiting their doctors showed a marked decline in the desire for marriage and children. Not because these women didn't want families, but because wanting something and being able to build towards it are completely two different things. When the path to a stable future becomes blocked, something quieter happens. You stop letting yourself want it as much, because wanting something you can't have is its own kind of suffering. And I've caught myself doing the same things as well, where I would talk myself out of things I genuinely want, like a better computer or a large wedding, for example, not because I didn't think they were worth wanting for, but because I quietly realized that they weren't realistic. And to be fair, I just stopped wanting them before I even got to the disappointment stage. And that's the quiet grief of a future you can see but can't reach. The conditions look different on the surface, as well as the mortgage rates, but the anxiety felt by both generations, by you and me, and everyone else in between, is all the same. Is the life I want even possible anymore? In 2024 alone, over 150,000 workers were laid off. Entry-level roles, the first ones on the ladder, the place where every generation proved itself before moving up, are disappearing fast across tech, finance, and beyond. Gen Z workers are less likely than any other generation to expect their financial insecurity to end, carrying the weight of the highest levels of doubt about their eventual ability to buy a home or retire of any generation ever measured. What Gen Z is experiencing isn't just financial pressure. It's the particular dread of not being able to plan, of waking up knowing that the structure you're trying to build your life inside could collapse through no fault of your own. You already know just how impossible it is to find a job, let alone keep one that doesn't burn you out after a few months. Having gotten fired myself recently just a few days ago, the looming idea of how exactly I'm going to pay my rent after I use the remaining savings in my account, which gonna last me about 3 months, is looming constantly over my head. And I know that you're living through the same sense of dread right now too. So, as you may start to expect, the feeling itself is not new. In 1969, the US government held its first draft lottery since World War II. On December 1st, young boomers across the country gathered around on television sets in dorms and apartments and watched as birthdays were pulled from a steel drum one by one. Each drum had a number from 1 to 365, and men whose birthdays landed in the first 100 numbers that were pulled were most always certainly to be deployed to Vietnam. I wanted to paint a picture for you as well. Imagine being 19 years old and watching the government play roulette with your life, watching your entire sense of forward motion suddenly hinge on a random draw from a drum. Many boomers changed their entire trajectories trying to navigate this. Some got married early because married men were eligible to defer. Some took on debt to stay enrolled in college because students were exempt. With that being said, all the burdens ended up falling hardest on working class kids with no path to college. A highly percentage of poor, minority, and working class young men ended up serving and dying in the Vietnam War than their wealthier counterparts. The stability boomers were supposedly handed was never evenly distributed. More than 10 million baby boomers served in the armed forces, and nearly 10% of the men in that generation went to Vietnam. And for the ones who came home, stability didn't just suddenly appear for them. Veterans were turned to unemployment rates double that of their non-veteran peers. One veteran described as if they were just slipping through the back door of the nation that sent him to war. There was no parades, no job offers, just a country that had moved on and an economy that hadn't saved a place for them. And then even for the boomers who avoided the draft, the economic ground started shifting when they started entering the workforce, especially en masse in the 1970s. They flooded a labor market that was simultaneously contracting. Historians have actually noted that having a massively credentialed young population with nowhere to place them has historically been a key driver of instability, and they predicted in the 2020s that the pattern would repeat itself. And they went wrong. Gen Z is the most credentialed generation in American history. They did what they were told and they got college degrees. However, 6 in 10 companies surveyed reported firing a recent university graduate they just hired. And when you look at that, you can't help but think about the fact that we can do everything right and still not be able to make it on the ladder nowadays. It is just the most miserable feeling ever that the working class Americans are still squeezed for everything we have left in our pockets before we even have the chance to fill them. The question itself, when I think about all this, continues to beg itself. Is the life I want even possible anymore? There's a particular kind of anxiety that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't feel like panic, it feels more like a weight, something pressing down on every decision you try to make, not dramatically of course, just persistently. Like every choice you face gets filtered through something that was there before you even started. 72% of student loan borrowers have made employment decisions based on their debt. Not career decisions, not passion decisions, employment decisions. Choices about where to spend the majority of their waking hours, not from ambition or meaning, but from what they owe. And the mental toll goes way beyond finances, because nearly 79% of borrowers report anxiety specifically because of their debt. More than 43% of people report homelessness, and in a 2024 study, 1 in 16 students said that their student loans have been a factor in experiencing suicidal ideation. I think about how much college was shoved down my throat my entire life. It was never presented as a choice. It was an expectation that came mostly from my parents. And I imagine you experienced the same thing as well. But at the end of the day, I still felt like I came out completely unprepared for the role that was in front of me. The expectation to go to college has been so thoroughly baked into our culture that the government started offering loans to help students get there. Now those loans stick with people for life, surviving even bankruptcy, while tuition keeps climbing because the government keeps lending and the parents keep pushing. A game that nobody wins except for the university pocketing the difference. And in fact, only Gen Z say their primary career goal is reaching a leadership position. The top goal, cited by 26% of Gen Z, is financial independence. Not success, not impact, not making a difference in the world in any meaningful way, literally just the freedom to not be controlled by what they owe. So when an entire generation stops dreaming about what they want to build and start dreaming about what it feels like to not be in debt, something has gone very wrong with the promise that was made to them. And that promise was broken very deliberately. Tuition at four-year institutions grew from about $12,000 a year in 1981 to nearly $25,000 in 2024, far outpacing both inflation and income growth. The explosion itself didn't happen naturally. In places like California, public university used to be nearly free. Then in 1967, Ronald Reagan ran for governor on a platform that explicitly targeted that system. He won, and public funding was pulled back and the costs just got pushed onto students, and the model spread far across the whole country. What used to be a shared investment became a personal bill, one that people now have to pay off for literal decades. The weight that Gen Z carries into every decision is the direct result of that conversion. No thanks to Ronald Reagan. But that weight, the feeling of a future that belongs to someone else before you've had a chance to claim it, it's not new. Let's paint another picture off the back of the one before. Imagine graduating in 1975. You did everything right, you got the degree, and you stayed out of Vietnam. And now you're trying to build a life inside of an economy that seems designed to make that impossible. Every time you save for something, inflation quietly erases a piece of it. The Great Inflation lasted from 1965 to 1982, nearly 2 decades of rising prices, 4 recessions, and an energy crisis, and the surreal experience of watching your paycheck buy less than what it did the year before, no matter how hard you worked. That was one of the scariest sights of all. The number that actually hit the hardest wasn't even unemployment. It was the feeling that even employment wasn't enough, that working a full week still left you behind, that the traditional path of school, stable work, build something, and retire had stopped adding up no matter how faithfully you tried to follow it. By 1974, something shifted on college campuses. A new grimness had set in because students who had spent years asking big questions about meaning and purpose suddenly pivoted hard towards financial security. Not because they stopped caring, but because survival had become the more pressing problem. The medium called them selfish, as the media tends to do with the newest generation, but what they were actually scared of was trying to find solid ground in a world that kept moving beneath their feet. Gen Z knows that feeling without it needing to be explained. Is the life I want even possible anymore? There's something that happens when you spend enough time scrolling. Not the obvious thing like comparing yourself to people. It's something quieter, because in the moment you put your phone down and realize that despite being connected to hundreds of people all day, you haven't actually felt close to anyone. Over the past 20 years, young adults have reduced in-person time with friends from 150 minutes per day, or just over 2 hours, to just 40 minutes. It's truly astounding how quick the collapse of friendship came, and it happened almost entirely within Gen Z's lifetime. We are the most connected generation ever measured, and the loneliest as well. The easiest answer is of course to blame the phone, but the phone didn't create the vacuum, it just moved to fill in one that was already there. If you're living in America right now and you walk 10 minutes in any direction from your average suburban home, you will find just more houses. Maybe a gas station, but no corner store, no park, no place where you can suddenly happen to bump into someone that you know. And definitely no reason to be outside at all unless you're getting in a car to go somewhere specific. That's my neighborhood, and I imagine yours is the same as well. The parking lots of the local Asian markets I frequent and the Trader Joe's my wife goes to every week are filled to the brim, but there's just nowhere to simply just be. And it is not an accident of geography or culture. I've never lived somewhere walkable before, but I find myself envying that life sometimes. The version where you pass through people naturally on a street, where community isn't something you have to schedule, and where connection doesn't have to require a plan. The physical world was redesigned for isolation before Gen Z was born. Single-family zoning, car-dependent roads, residential areas legally separated from everything else that makes spontaneous human interaction possible. The ideas were conceived between 1920 to 1950 and implemented for decades after, and then a smartphone arrived to offer a substitute, not to fix the loneliness, but to profit from it. But here's the part that nobody really shines a light on, and it is that the boomers themselves were the ones moving into these cul-de-sacs, the ones that watched these corner stores get replaced by strip malls and where parking lots took over the world by storm. They felt the first tremors of what they were building. They came of age of watching leaders get assassinated. They watched Watergate expose rottenness at the center of their government, and growing up under the real threat of nuclear war had given them an acute sense that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. When I think about this era as I learned through it in history class, I hadn't truly realized just how dreadful it was to live in a time where you seriously didn't know if you or your family was going to get bombed tomorrow or next week. In the same era, the 1970s brought rising youth unemployment, eroding faith in every institution that they've been told to trust, and a political and ideological aimlessness that left an entire generation searching for somewhere to belong. Does that feel familiar? Because Gen Z's institutional trust is at historic lows, lower than any generation previously recorded. Of those experiencing loneliness, 65% say they feel fundamentally disconnected not just from specific people, but from the world itself. The same hunger, the same sense of floating without an anchor, the same question continues to ask. Is the life I want even possible anymore? Think about everything you just heard. Two generations, the same fears, and the same question being asked. The same four walls itself closing in on them. When I did my research, I knew that to some levels when boomers say they had it rough, that it did come from a real place. Looking back though, being drafted in almost 2 decades of recessions, rising prices outpacing wages, I mean the similarities are literally right there. Hearing all of these challenges, it's like they never had an opportunity at all to make it out of this rat race. But as you can expect, they still somehow did. Their mortgage rates came down, the draft ended, and stagflation broke. The economy nearly expanded for 2 decades straight, and the community infrastructure, fraying as it was, still had enough shape to catch the people falling through the cracks. For boomers, that question of, is the life I want even possible anymore, eventually got answered. The answer was yes. And that answer wasn't luck, it wasn't resilience, it wasn't because boomers were made of something different than the rest of us. It was because underneath all that anxiety, underneath all that uncertainty, there was something holding. A floor built by the generation before them. Government-backed mortgages that made home ownership achievable for ordinary people. Public universities that, while growing, still costed just only a summer's worth of work. Strong and robust unions that actually created contracts that converted decades of labor into guaranteed wages. A retirement you could actually count on, funded by your employer and not just yourself. And a physical world that still had enough community left in it to pull back people towards each other when they needed it the most. The floor caught them. The social safety net existed. And here's the honest and uncomfortable part of where this story lives. Most boomers didn't experience the floor as something fragile. They experienced it as just the way things worked. And when they became homeowners, their property values started climbing. And when their retirement started depending on the values of their homes to climb, they made choices that protected what they had built. They voted against new housing developments in their neighborhoods, not because they sat in a room and twiddled their thumbs and thought that they were going to make things hard for the next generation, but because, more realistically, more housing just meant more supply. More supply meant that their home, which was their retirement, their security, and their entire financial future, was going to be worth less. And if Gen Z was presented the same information and thrusted back in time, we too would have done the same thing, because we wouldn't have known any better, and boomers certainly didn't either. But I still won't grant them that much leniency, because at the end of the day, they still kept neighborhoods the way they were, and they still supported politicians who promised to protect what they had at the cost of other people. And the political class that carried all this forward looked, for decades, exactly like them. I want you to consider this. Bill Clinton was born in August of 1946. George W. Bush was born in July of 1946, and Donald Trump was born in June of 1946. 3 of the last 4 presidents of the United States were born in the same goddamn summer of 1946. So let that sit for a second. Every president from 1993 until today has been a baby boomer. The generation that inherited this floor, this social safety net, has been holding the lever of American political power for over 30 years. And during those 30 years, not through any single dramatic decision, but through thousands of smaller ones, the floor, the safety net got taken apart, public universities got defunded, workers got reclassified as contractors, and affordable housing development got blocked. Union protections got stripped, pensions got replaced with 401ks that shifted all the risk, by the way, from employers onto workers, and cities got designed further and further away from any semblance of community as highways were built right on top of Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. Most boomers didn't think of this as pulling the ladder up, they thought of it as protecting what they earned. But the effect on everyone who came after them was still the same, which means the question that this video has actually been building towards the whole time isn't about boomers at all. It's this: what does a generation do when they face all of this and there is no floor? because that question has been answered before. Not by boomers, not by Gen X, but by a generation that faced everything we've just described, the housing, the debt, the instability, the isolation, without a single one of the protections we take for granted. No minimum wage, no weekend, no labor rights, no safety net of any kind. They had less than we have, and they faced more than we faced. They were standing in a moment that looked from the outside exactly like this one. Overwhelming, rigged, and immovable. Before we talk about what Gen Z is already building, and we will, I want to show you exactly who these people were, what they were up against, and what it actually cost them to keep going when every reasonable person would have stopped. And here's what the research made me believe. That we as Gen Z are more capable of building something lasting than we give ourselves credit for. Not despite the anxiety, but because of it. Because without already knowing it, we've been following the footsteps of the greatest generation. Because I think once you know their story, you'll come out of this really understanding what we can do to make things right. I want to tell you about a woman named Mary. She was born in Cook, Ireland in 1837. Her family fled to Canada during the potato famine, which was one of the most catastrophic humanitarian disasters of the 19th century. She eventually made her way to the United States, where she first worked as a teacher and then as a dressmaker in Memphis, Tennessee. She married a man named George Jones, and together they had 4 children. In 1867, though, a yellow fever epidemic swept through Memphis. It killed her husband, and it killed all 4 of her children. Mary Harris Jones lost everything in a single season. She moved back to Chicago and rebuilt. She opened a new dressmaking shop, a small one, but hers, and in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroyed it. Every last thing she owned was gone. At this point in her story, Mary Harris Jones had every reason to give up. She had no family, no home, no savings, and she was in her mid-30s in a country that had no social safety net, no retirement system, no unemployment insurance, no meaningful labor protections, and if you couldn't work, you starved. If you got sick, you hoped for charity. If you were a woman without a husband in 1871, the world had very little structural interest in whether you survived. But instead of retreating, she walked into the meeting of the Knights of Labor, one of the earliest labor organizing efforts in American history, and discovered something unexpected. She was good at this. In fact, she was so effective at organizing workers that a United States attorney would eventually call her the most dangerous woman in America. She would become known simply as Mother Jones, and she would spend the next 6 decades of her life doing the work that would help build the floor that the boomers had stood on. But to understand why her story matters, you first have to understand the world she was fighting inside. The Gilded Age, roughly from 1870 to 1900, is what happens when you take every force we talked about in this video and remove every single check on them simultaneously. Imagine waking up at 5 a.m. to work in a 16-hour shift in a steel mill, not because you chose it, but because that was a job, and the job was the only thing standing between you and your family starving. Your 8-year-old child works as well, in a textile mill down the road because one income simply isn't enough. You live in a tenement apartment shared with 2 other families, where the walls are very thin, the pipes leak, and the disease moves through the building, and it moves very fast. There is no sick leave, there is no weekend, and there is no minimum wage. No one whose job it is to care about whether you made it home safely or healthily for that matter. This wasn't the experience of a few unlucky people, this was the design condition of an entire class in the United States, and the people who designed it had an explanation ready for anyone who complained. They called it social Darwinism, the belief that the stronger were meant to grow stronger and that inequality wasn't just inevitable but natural and correct. The suffering of the poor was evidence of their unfitness, not an evidence of a broken system. The richest families in America didn't apologize for their wealth, and in fact they literally published essays explaining why they deserved it and why everyone else deserved what they got. A system that pushed down women and people of color especially was also a system that made them feel like their fate was by their own individual design. If that sounds familiar, it's because today we call it meritocracy. The billionaire earned his billions. The person working 3 jobs to pay rent simply hasn't worked hard enough yet. Different vocabulary, same argument, same function. To make the people at the bottom feel personally responsible for the conditions that were designed above their heads. By 1890, the wealthiest 1% of the American families controlled 51% of the nation's real and personal property. Today, the 400 wealthiest American families possess more wealth than the bottom 150 American millions combined, and the numbers itself, while they're different, the architecture itself is still the same. Every single thing we take for granted as the baseline protection today, the weekend, the minimum wage, child labor laws, and workplace safety regulations, social security, unemployment, insurance, the right to organize, all of that did not exist. And the men who benefited from that arrangement had names, they had faces, and they had enormous political power they used deliberately to keep it that way. Andrew Carnegie, by almost every measure, was the richest man in America by the 1890s. His steel empire produced more than the entirety of Great Britain. Carnegie was also very careful about his public image. He wrote essays on the responsibility of wealth, he donated libraries, and spoke openly about the dignity of labor. And then he hired Henry Clay Frick. Where Carnegie performed concern for workers in public, Frick made no such pretense. He was the operational reality behind Carnegie's carefully maintained image, the man who did what Carnegie wanted done without Carnegie having to say it out loud. In 1892, the contract between Carnegie Steel and the largest union in the steel industry was set to expire. Despite record profits, Frick demanded wage cuts for the workers who had already taken cuts 3 years earlier. At that time, Carnegie was conveniently located in Scotland, but he wrote to Frick saying simply, "We approve of anything you do." So here's what Frick ended up doing. Frick locked out all 3,800 workers, and he built a barbed wire fence around the plant. Workers had nicknamed it Fort Frick. The governor sent 8,500 state militia troops. The plant reopened with replacement workers by November, and the union itself had collapsed. In the 9 years after the homestead, Carnegie Steel profits rose to $106 million. The most skilled workers saw their wages shrink by 1/5, and their shifts grew back to 12 hours. The government had deployed its military on behalf of a corporation against its citizens, and the legal and political system let it happen. Now think about the Gen Z equivalent. A corporation reclassifies the workforce as independent contractors to eliminate benefits and collective bargaining. Perfectly legal. A private equity firm acquires a hospital chain, cuts staff, raises prices, also perfectly legal. A real estate investment trust purchases thousands of single-family homes, converts them into rentals, and algorithmically raises the rent every 90 days, which is as well perfectly legal. So here's the part of the story that no motivational poster will just tell you. The Homestead Strike of 1892 was a catastrophic defeat. The union was destroyed, the workers went back to 12-hour shifts at lower wages, and Carnegie's profits soared. And the dominant consensus held that it was simply just how things worked, that the market had spoken, and that the strong had prevailed, and that anyone who objected was a radical or an anarchist. If I think about how if this were to happen today, and I would have seen the news, I would have thought that this honestly would have been it. That this country was owned by the rich and governed by the elite. There's nothing we can do to stop them at this point. And this was a world where I definitely would have given up. But Mother Jones didn't. In the years following the Homestead Strike, she traveled from mining town to mining town across West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Colorado, places most politicians had never visited and had no intentions of visiting. In 1903, she led a group of child textile mill workers on a 125-mile march from Philadelphia to the summer home of President Theodore Roosevelt in New York. These were children, some of them missing fingers from factory machinery, some who had never even gone to school because the mills had needed them at dawn. They carried signs that read, "We want to go to school, not to the mines." Roosevelt refused to see them. But the image of those children walking 125 miles filled newspapers across the country and lodged itself into the public conscience in the way that no policy argument ever could. Mother Jones was arrested repeatedly. In 1912, a military tribunal in West Virginia convicted her of conspiracy to commit murder and held her under a house arrest for weeks. She was in her mid-70s and she had lost her husband and 4 children to yellow fever. She had lost everything she owned twice over, and she was still considered dangerous enough to be imprisoned. She kept going. And while she kept going, the pressure was slowly changing them in ways that were inevitable until suddenly they weren't. In 1911, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. 146 workers died, mostly young immigrant women, because of the fact that the factory doors had been locked from the outside to prevent theft. The public outrage that followed produced more than 30 new health and safety laws in a single year, not because politicians suddenly developed a conscience, but because political cost of inaction finally became higher than the cost of acting. Think about the next time you have to leave work at 5 p.m. Think about the next time you take a sick day. Think about it on a Sunday morning. The weekend you're spending right now was not given to you. It was extracted from people who had nothing through decades of organizing, striking, marching, and dying until the people in power had no choice but to concede to it. The minimum wage, child labor laws, social security, the right to even organize, none of it was inevitable and none of it came quickly. From the Homestead Strike in 1892 to the passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935 was 43 years. 43 years of defeats, arrests, deaths, and the relentless pressure before the law finally caught up with the movement. And for Mother Jones, she passed away in 1930 at the age of 93. 5 years before the law that she had spent her life fighting for was passed. Her funeral brought more than 25,000 working people to a town of only 3,000 people. She never even got to see a finished house, but she kept laying the foundation anyway, not because victory was guaranteed, but because accepting a world designed against her was something she had decided she simply could not do. Everything the boomers inherited, every plank of the floor that caught them, was built by people like her. The Progressive Era generation in 1895 looked, from the outside, like a generation that was losing. The billionaires were getting richer, and the political system was openly captured by industrial money, and the dominant cultural narrative was that poverty was a natural result of personal failure. From the outside, in 1895, you would not have predicted what came next. All of that was built from the ruins of what looked like total defeat. And here's the thing I haven't said yet, the thing that I think is the most important sentence in this entire video. Gen Z is already building the new foundations. Most of them don't know it yet, but the same way Mother Jones didn't know in 1872 that she was laying the groundwork for legislation that wouldn't pass for another 60 years, the same way that organizers who lost at Homestead in 1892 didn't know they were planting the seeds that would become the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, you don't get to see the finished house when you're laying the foundations. You just have to keep laying it. And there's more of that happening right now than most people realize. So let me tell you about what happened in Nepal in September of 2025. For years, young Nepalis had watched the same circle of aging politicians rotate the prime ministership between themselves. The same three men swapping out the same seat decade after decade, while youth unemployment climbed, corruption flourished, and thousands of skilled young people left the country every single day because they saw no future in it. Then, in September of 2025, the government made a decision that would prove to be its last. In September 4th, they banned 26 major social media platforms, including YouTube, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and Twitter. The ban was designed to silence a viral trend called Nepo babies, where young people posted videos that contrasted the lavish lifestyles of politicians' children with the daily economic struggles of ordinary Nepalis. Rather than silence the movement, the ban itself on social media ended up igniting it even further. Protesters used VPNs and posted flyers with QR codes to evade detection. The crackdown swelled the movement further. At least 76 people were killed and the parliament building burned, and on September 9th, the prime minister resigned. On a Discord server that swelled to over 100,000 members, 10,000 people gathered virtually to debate who should lead an interim government. Nepal's first woman prime minister was sworn in as an interim leader, and elections were called, and on March 5th, 2026, Balendra Shah, a 35-year-old former rapper, led his party to a nearly supermajority in the parliament, the first time a single party had outright won a majority since 1999. A generation that was told that it was too apathetic, too glued to its phone to care about the real world, too anxious, too fragile, too distracted to build anything, just toppled the government on Discord. And also One Piece. But Nepal isn't alone. In 2025, new demonstrations emerged in more than 70 countries: Indonesia, Morocco, Madagascar, the Philippines, Peru, Serbia, and beyond. Leaderless, decentralized, and organized through TikTok, Discord, and Instagram, united by the same core demand that the people at the top stop treating the resources of the nation as their personal inheritance. A sociologist studying these movements put it plainly: this is a generation that is not acting only for itself, but so that everyone else has access to education, healthcare, and housing. And to put an end to corruption in power, it is a process driven by universal values. In the United States, while global protests were making headlines, something quieter but equally significant was happening in places where work was getting done. 77% of Americans aged 18 to 34 approve of labor unions, the highest of any age group, and the highest overall group rating for unions in over half a century. Gen Z workers have formed unions at 336 Starbucks locations across 44 states, and the average age of the Amazon labor union organizers, who won the first successful union drive in Amazon history, was only 26 years old. A 17-year-old organizer in upstate New York said it plainly: "I feel like the baby boomers started at the start of the line, and now we're farther and farther behind. Gen X are a mile behind, millennials are 2 miles behind, and my generation is now 5 miles behind. We're just sick of them saying we have equal opportunities." The Starbucks barista who organized at her store at 19 isn't thinking about the labor law that will pass in 2045. She's thinking about her next shift and whether or not she can afford rent. The Nepali student who chose a prime minister on Discord wasn't thinking about the constitutional precedent she was setting. She was thinking about the politicians who had failed her for generations for as long as she could remember. That's how floors get built, not through grand historical vision, but through the immediate problem in front of you, addressed with enough conviction that you're willing to take the risk on. So here's a question that this entire video has been building towards. Not will things get better or our generation will it be okay, but what kind of people do we want to be while we do the work? Because that's what Mother Jones was really answering when she kept going herself. Not will I live to see the change? She didn't know that, of course. She organized for 60 years and died in 1930, 5 years before the NLRA passed, like I said. She never got to see the full floor she helped build. But she said something in 1902, standing in front of striking miners in West Virginia, that I think is the most honest thing anyone has ever said about why you do the work and when the outcome isn't guaranteed. My friends, it is the solidarity of labor we want. We do not want to find fault within each other, but to solidify our choices and say to each other, we must be together. Our masters join together, and we must do the same thing. The people who own the apartments, the people who fund the campaigns, the people who lobby to defund your university, reclassify your job, and zone your neighborhood into isolation. our masters joined together. They have been organized for a very long time, and they have been extraordinarily effective at keeping the rest of us pointed at each other instead of them. Mother Jones had to march 125 miles on foot to get the attention of the president. You have a device in your pocket that can reach 100 million people before he finishes breakfast, and also to rage bait him if you wanted to. The same infrastructure that was built to sell you things and keep you scrolling can be redirected. The same attention economy that profits from your isolation can be used to find the people who feel exactly what you feel and are ready to do something about it. And I'm going to try something different as well. Instead of listing several ways you can contribute like I've done with previous videos, I'm going to leave you only 2 sources in the description for you to check out. The first is a link to the Rutgers Democracy Lab, and here you can choose the impact level of your actions based on your level of time and comfortability. For me, I chose the last one since I have a lot more time after I got fired from my job to focus on YouTube, and I intend to make my channel be the grounds of an advocacy campaign. While it is anywhere near there yet, your comments and your watching of this video is proof enough to me that what I'm building here is real, even if it's going to be slow. I want you to find out what you are comfortable with doing that you think will make a difference, because I want you to utilize the energy that I know for a fact you feel to make some real semblance of a difference out there. So whether it's 5 to 10 minutes of work that you can do by finding a petition you can sign online, or to really start building an organization from the ground up, you have ways of making a difference. And that's the key takeaway that I want you to come out of this video with. The second source I wanted to talk about is Indivisible, and after looking through many organizations after doing research for other videos, I found that this is the easiest one for most people to just put your information in, find your nearest chapter, and immediately start contributing locally. This same organization was responsible for setting up local chapters across the country for the most recent historic No Kings protest, which by the way had more people show up in history than what previously was before, a record set by the previous 2 No Kings protests. So needless to say, they aren't chumps in the political game. They know what they're doing for sure, and I highly recommend you check them out if you want to start joining a chapter and lending whatever talents you can to really do something in person and to build a community that we've all been looking for. But let's go back to what Gen Z is capable of, because by late 2025, it was unmistakable that the grievances of Gen Z were reshaping political life around the world. A generation written off as apathetic had become, in the span of a single year, one of the most consequential political forces on the planet. This didn't happen because they stopped being anxious, it happened because they decided to act inside the anxiety instead of waiting for it to go away. The floor you are standing on right now, however imperfect, inadequate, and full of gaps, was built by people who had far less than you, faced more than you, and kept building anyway. Not because the victory was certain, but because the alternative was accepting a world that was designed against them. And the floor that the next generation will stand on, that's being built right now. In the Discord servers, in the union drives, in the city council meetings, the tenant organizings, the local elections, and the small dinner table conversations we have, and all the small decisions to show up instead of just scroll past. It is being built by you, whether you know it yet or not. Is the life I want even possible anymore? That's the question that this video started with, and it's one that I've echoed many times in this video. The only honest answer I have to that question is this: not yet, not completely, but definitely not without a fight. Because the fight has already started, and you were already in it.